Be more optimistic about others' willingness to act. This is a serious problem. Many people around the world recognize it, and many are willing to act. And many expect everyone else to act. It's very hard for me to say where to start. The important message here is do start.
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Breaker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador podcast. Through this series, I'm really just trying to inspire you to get a little bit further along in your own path to understanding an issue, to developing a program, to creating a collaboration, but ultimately, hopefully, learning how to and getting closer to solving the challenges that we face. In this episode, I'm extremely excited to be joined by Peter Andre, who's the assistant professor at SAFE, the Sustainable Architecture for Finance in Europe. Several weeks ago, he and his colleagues released a report in Nature Climate Change entitled Globally Representative Evidence on Actual and Perceived Support for Climate Action, where they looked at what are people doing, expecting, and what are the norms around taking climate action. It's a phenomenal report, which we will link below, and it's one that we will discuss not just in terms of how we conducted it and the findings, but what does it mean? What does it mean in terms of how do we nudge people to do better? What are the expectations of systems, and how can we make systems easier? What are other things that stakeholders can do with this research to take it forward, to turn it from we would do something into we are doing something? So with that, Peter, welcome to the Sustainable Ambassador podcast. Great to have you here to talk about the work you're doing, the research you just conducted, and what it all means to us in the sustainability space. Before we get into that, though, as a starting point, it'd be great if you could introduce yourself and a little about the work and research that you've been doing over there.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So, as you already said, I'm a behavioral economist and I study how people reason about the complex economic problems they face and the difficult decisions they have to make. Understanding lay people's perspectives on economic issues is quite important if we want to make sense of their behavior, and that is what part of my research focuses on. Another part, a little is on people's perception on climate change and their perceptions of how others think about climate change.
I've noticed that a number of your research studies and some of the work that you've been doing is related to sustainability, both environmental and social. I'm kind of wondering what brought you into the space to begin with, and how or why are you marrying behavioral economics to that challenge?
Like an important origin of my motivation is a puzzle. Many things go wrong in this world. That's not hard to tell. Climate change is a prime example. It has huge consequences. We know about this. We know what to do, but still we don't do enough. At the same time, I'm mostly meeting great, nice, and genuinely good people. So how is that possible? What's happening here? How can so many good people mess it up so badly? Put simply, is a puzzle for me, and was motivation enough for me to look at this problem from a behavioral perspective.
And is the behavioral perspective kind of like a key or a lens to understanding? And what's the role of behavioral economics to nudge or change behavior from the work that you've been doing?
The behavioral lens acknowledges, in contrast to more traditional economics, that people are not only motivated by hard incentives and money, for example, but also care about others, might misperceive and misunderstand the situation they are in, might struggle to understand the long-term consequences of their behavior on climate change, might struggle with the abstract nature of climate change because they are no statisticians, they are no experts. In many ways, it's just a richer psychological description of the person who is making a decision, a lens that other social sciences like psychology and sociology have been endorsing for many, many years, and economists have embraced it via behavioral economics much more recently.
And, just broadly speaking, do you find that it takes a lot in terms of economics to move people on sustainability?
Well, I think my general view, and this will be echoed when we talk about the research study later, is that most people care about climate change and would like to act, and in general are willing to act. But then it's extremely difficult to do this in practice. Consequences are abstract. Then individuals act on markets, but markets mediate and dampen individual behavior in very complex ways. Plus, we have misperceptions of social norms. We'll talk about this later too. So it's just extremely hard.
And then once we kind of understand some of these things, how hardwired would you argue behaviors are to economics? Like, are they easy to change? Like, once we identify that lever, is it easy to move it, or does it take time? Does it take education? Is it a function of economics and one thing's more expensive than the other? Like, how easy is it to get people to change once there's that recognition and once there's that focus?
Well, it's a difficult question, and it's important to acknowledge that there are many, many things that are important for individual behavior. So changing one thing is not gonna have the large impact. Maybe with the exception of economic incentives, in the end, we all need to respond to them. So like a very large tax on carbon emissions, for example, would bring us a very long way. But then there might be other reasons why people are, hesitant to support such ideas politically. Again, for various reasons. So I think the issue we are facing is not that it's super hard to change to influence, encourage climate-friendly behavior. It's just many things that matter, and it takes time. That's a really important issue. It takes time. Norms don't change from one day to the other. We basically aim for a new normative equilibrium, and getting there takes time.
With that, let's get into the study and the work that came out. I mean, the headline was very good. The top line results that you're reporting, they really carried through. And I would love to have you like introduce the study itself and maybe some of the guiding questions or the core questions you were trying to answer through this research.
Climate change is a global problem. It has global consequences and it requires a global solution. But before we started the study, we did not know where in this world and to what extent people are actually willing to act against climate change. This data was simply not existent there. I mean, there's a lot of research in the United States, Canada, Europe, and so on, but we do not have this comparative snapshot. And our goal was to deliver this snapshot of the global state of mind in this respect. These were the goals that we had when we started.
What was the journey like? What was the framework, or what were the questions that you're aiming to answer through this, besides just what are people willing to do? Like, were you getting into how are they willing to act and who they view as responsible? Like, what was the bigger framework or the bigger scope here?
Yeah, we were able to interview about 130,000 individuals in 125 countries across the world. More than 90% of the global population, more than 90% of the global greenhouse gases, and also the global gross domestic product, so the economic product, so to say. Right? So in each country, we basically draw a probability-based sample. So the people we talk to are able to represent the diversity, the broad diversity of the views in their country. That's quite important because we want the results to be comparable across countries.
Okay.
Now, our goals were to shed light on three easy questions. Are people willing to contribute money, give up money in order to act against climate change? Here we ask whether people are willing to contribute 1% of their income in order to fight global warming. We wanted to understand whether they think other people in their country should act. So this should highlights the normative aspect, which is quite important for human behavior in general. We like to conform to what other people think we should do. And finally, institutional solutions, policy solutions are quite important. So we ask whether people think their national government should do more to fight global warming. These are the three simple questions that we asked.
And asking that second question, was the reasoning behind it kind of the idea that if others around me accept and are willing to give, therefore I'm more willing to? They're more willing to actually execute on the first question, assuming they said yes.
Yes, exactly. So social norms have two important dimensions. One thing is what people do in generally, and what I think others do around me, and then what I think others think I should do. Both influence my behavior through different channels. One channel is just, what others do is quite informative for what could be the better action. So I'm going to follow this. At the same time, I also like to conform to what others think should be done because that's how humans live together. They're quite good at following an implicitly shared rule of norms, rules that people understand and like to follow. And we also tend to punish each other for not following these norms. So what I think others think I should do is actually a very strong predictor of my behavior in many domains. And so we wanted to understand how does it look?
So what were the conclusions? I mean, you asked these three questions, you're after these kind of three different areas. What did you find?
So what we find is that 69% of the people we interviewed are willing to contribute 1% of their income to fight global warming. That's what they report. 86% say others in their country should try to fight global warming. 89%, that's almost every ninth person out of 10 globally, thinks the national government should do more to fight global warming. So in short, we find a lot of general support for more climate action across the globe.
How did you ask that question? Was it just that direct? Like, would you contribute 1%? What does that number mean to you as a researcher? Like, when you see those three numbers, what did you feel, and like, what are the takeaways from your perspective?
Yeah, we had to keep it simple because we wanted to field the very same question in 125 countries with very diverse educational cultural backgrounds. So we had to keep it simple. We literally asked, would you be willing to contribute 1% of your household income in order to fight global warming? And well, yes, I think we were surprised by the results. We expected, in line with many other people across this world, little bit less support. I think it also alludes a little bit to this puzzle that we started with, that many people care and are willing to act, but then in practice, it often seems much harder. And I think that is a challenge that remains. Like, survey results reflect the potential, and there's a lot of potential, a lot of general support, but translating this into concrete behaviors remains a challenge. But it's a different challenge.
How do you align that number, that willingness to spend money, against a market where there's a lot of reports that people are not willing to spend money? Like, how do you view those two realities? And I'm not saying that either one is wrong or both are right, or one is wrong and one is like, but how can both be true? Or is it just a matter of conversion from that 69%, say, to less than 69%? Like, is there a gap there that you see, or that you're questioning now?
That's a difficult question, and that's one of the things that more work needs to be done on. The examples you gave are very good examples, because in practice, if I want to buy sustainable good, I need to have trust in its claim for sustainability. I need to be able to suppress my self-interest in the very moment of decision making, and this has to be done whenever I'm in the supermarket making a decision. That's extremely difficult. It requires a lot of self-control in various moments. That's much harder than like a general decision or like the general intention to fight against global warming. I also need to understand the long-term implications. Many green investments that households can make are actually even economically sensible. They pay off, in particular in light of the policy changes that we should expect for the future. But this is not easy to understand, so that there are also knowledge and perception gaps that need to be addressed. We are talking a lot about this gap, and it exists and it's important, but I'm a little bit afraid that because we talk about this too much, like the big message is easy to forget again, which is that in general, there's a lot of support, which I think is quite encouraging.
Yeah.
And a change to the debate a little bit. We can talk a little bit less about whether people are willing, and talk more about how we can translate this into practice and how we want to proceed precisely.
Yeah, and I think this is where I get into the work that we've been doing, which is like understanding who's willing to pay, how much extra they're willing to pay, how do you communicate to them? And I have kind of like 6 phases of, like this thing. And the last one is don't lie to them. Because what I find interesting about the space, you're mentioning trust, is that once you break the trust, it's really hard as a category or as a brand to rebuild trust. And I think like the plant-based movement really experienced both of those in the last 18 months, where a lot of people just didn't see the benefit, or they didn't believe the packaging, and the market kind of fell apart, although millions of people were willing to spend a premium for a higher quality, higher health, lower environmental footprint product. Like, that was kind of proven.
I agree with this, and that is probably a problem that not only individual brands face, but also society as a whole. Like, one brand being dishonest to consumers and this being a scandal in the media will also reduce trust in other brands. So it's a societal level problem that we would need to make progress on. I agree. But I mean, part of that is also that a lot of the individual decision making is really left to individuals. There are some solutions to tackling climate change that require less from individuals. For example, a carbon tax makes sure that at the counter, the sustainable, quality, the climate change impact of a good is already priced in, is reflected in the price tag, which is much easier for consumers to digest and to base their decision on. To the extent that carbon taxes are not sufficient, this requires individuals to judge by themselves what the impact of their good is, and that is a really difficult decision.
And did you actually ask any further questions, like what type of regulation or what type of products would you spend more money for, or was it just the top line questions?
We only have this top line question for this broad international survey. But I absolutely agree with your interpretation, or let me put it cautiously. I think that's a very plausible interpretation of the results. The support for more policy action is even higher than the willingness to contribute 1%. And I think there are many good reasons to say, I think politics should do more, even though I myself am not yet willing to make changes to my own behavior. I think that's perfectly plausible and reasonable. And the reason for that is that some institutional changes will make it so much easier for many individuals to act on their good intentions. There's also a behavioral dimension here. People in the social sciences, we say that humans tend to be conditionally cooperative. So they hate to be the only one doing the good stuff. So policy is also, from an individual behavioral perspective, quite an attractive lever.
You take these 3 questions against 125 countries. Did you find that there was sensitivity for the first question on willingness to spend based on country? And was there anything that you could take away from that?
Well, we do see that in richer countries, less people are willing to contribute 1%. These are the countries where the strong lifestyle changes will be required. These are also countries who can more easily afford to adopt to the consequences of climate change. So there we find lower willingness to contribute. Again, I want to stress, it's still very high. It's just lower in relative terms. But we also look at a second pattern. That pattern is that in warmer countries with a higher baseline temperature in the last years, we find a higher willingness to contribute. So these are countries that are more exposed to the consequences of climate change, that have witnessed more severe consequences of climate change already. There we see a higher willingness to contribute. And in those countries, we also tend to see a higher willingness to ask for even more policy support.
I've traveled around Asia for many years working this issue. And what I find interesting is, in reality, it's only the Philippines. When I talk to entrepreneurs and brands there, when I ask them, why are you doing this? First answer, climate change. Because if you think about it, they're so exposed to the typhoons regularly coming through and the intensity, and they see at least one a year, if not multiple, where Thailand, Indonesia, also equally vulnerable, say, from sea level rise. They don't speak about it as frequently, climate change, because sea level rise is kind of distant for them. But the more kind of, you see it and you feel it in your backyard, the more likely you are to do something about it or expect others to.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And maybe to add another nuance to it, most of the research in the behavioral sciences, also on climate change, is actually done in Western countries, particularly in the US. These are, however, the countries who are least willing to act. Climate skepticism also plays a role. And by studying them so extensively, I think it's easy to misportray the global extent of skepticism.
And actually, to that point, who did you want reading this? When you were writing this research, when you're coming up with the questions, when you're framing it in your mind, like, who did you want reading this, and what were you hoping they would either get from it or do with it afterwards?
Our hope is that we reach, let's say, 2 primary groups now. One is the general public. To the extent that this is possible, we want to shift and correct this misperception. Let's not be pessimistic. Let's not echo the loud and well-organized minorities too strongly, who are skeptical about climate change and not willing to do anything. Right. Let's not forget that large majorities are willing to act. This is one central message, and because we care as humans, as individuals, what others think, it's important to realize that this consensus or this large support exists. This is one goal that we would be very happy if we can make a little step towards it with the study. I think the other audience group that we would be happy to reach our stakeholders in international climate politics, policymakers, and those who support them, because for them as well, I think it's hopefully encouraging to know about this large general support, and maybe together this helps to shift the debate forward. Rather than talking about whether there's willingness at all, let's talk about how this willingness can be translated into practice and how climate change can be tackled.
What do you think are the answers to getting people to actually spend money? Like, are there some takeaways from you that, like, you're positive on this, we just need to figure it out? And if so, like, as a behavioral economist, like, how would you get started?
To keep it simple, let me focus on one concrete step, which is to be more optimistic about others' willingness to act. This is a serious problem. Many people around the world recognize it, and many are willing to act, and many expect everyone else to act.
The economic norms for me almost need to change. Like, that willingness to spend is a economic function as much as it is a social function. So is it just seeing that other people are putting up solar panels and buying EVs and they stop spraying their grass with pesticides? Like, are those the signals we're looking for before we spend, or is it something else?
Well, from an economic perspective, I think it's important to stress that putting a price tag on producing carbon is quite important. It also makes individuals' lives so much easier because they can focus on the money part, and making environmentally sustainable behavior easier. And as a consequence of that, you will already see more people choosing the environmental friendly option. And as a consequence of that, you would see a change in the perceived norms. And as a consequence of that, that would encourage others' climate friendly behavior and so on. So you see that all of these levers lead to positive feedback cycles. And it's very hard for me to say where to start. The important message here is do start.
How can brands or politicians, nonprofits, academics leverage the work that you've done? Like, what are some of the conversations you've had about how this can be used for others to go forward?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, the data are now available. We'll be very happy if the data are used by other researchers with their own creative ideas for questions that we might haven't thought of even. The other thing is that I mean, there are some clear open questions that we've already talked about. So one is, how can we translate this general support into concrete actions? And that is a classic question in the behavioral scientists. Many colleagues are working on this. We actually know quite a bit about it. I say we know enough to get started, to catch up in practice, but there will be more exciting research in the future. And the other question that I'm now puzzled by is how is it possible that so large misperceptions arise? We have documented this globally, but more, let's say, focus studies, detailed studies document this over and over again for climate change, but also in other domains. Why is it possible that we misperceive what others think? These misperceptions matter, so it has practical relevance, the question, but it's also just academically, I'm extremely curious about getting closer to an answer here.
A lot of brands will say it's up to the individual, but then you look at the system. The system's not really designed or made easy for individuals to see that impact at the end of the day. They're kind of waiting for a government regulation to come in and just make it even across the playing field.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to adopt this to understand individual behavior, but effective solutions will often involve changes of the system. I'm not talking about deviating from market-based solutions, but we need to steer the market in a way that allows it to actually let people follow up on their good intentions in an effective way.
When you're looking at these questions, do you think it's effective to remove choice, like saying you can't have that anymore? Or do we have to kind of find ways where people can still feel like they have choice, but that regardless of what they do, the system is there to make sure that they don't go beyond the bounds? Like, what's the balance between consumer choice and markets and regulation and removal of choice?
I think in the end, it depends on the context. Both is needed. Removing choice is difficult because it rightly leads to more concerns about freedom, some form of unhealthy paternalism maybe. But in some cases, it might be more effective and even fairer because rich people can always pay the higher price. So if you don't remove choice, then maybe the burden is distributed unfairly.
All right, as a couple last questions, people got this far. What are 2 or 3 things you wish that they knew now? What are the takeaways you wish they would remember? What are the actions you wish that they would take? What are the things you hope to come out of this research from here?
Don't be pessimistic. Many other people care like you about climate change and are willing to act. It's difficult to do this in practice, but so let's work on this. Let's focus on how we can get the most out of our general support for climate action. Let's make sure politicians don't forget that support for climate policy is actually large as well. And let's insist.